And it is my honor to welcome the President of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid. Excellency, you have the floor.
His Royal Highness Dr. Zeid Al Hussein, President of the International Peace Institute, Excellencies, I'm pleased to join all of you today for a discussion on accelerating climate finance by 2030. Let me commend the International Peace Institute in partnership with the Government of Qatar for organizing this important event. IPI has always been at the forefront of innovative policy research, and today's event resonates after COP26. While recent climate summits did not meet our expectations, it did continue to push us in the right direction. As a president of Hope, I'm optimistic that we can still achieve meaningful progress, that we will get to where we need to be. Recent developments are somewhat encouraging. As part of Glasgow Climate Pact, the 1.5 target was kept alive, even in the ICU. There was agreement to increase the pace of climate action, including through submission of revised NDCs at COP27 in Egypt, and conclusion of the outstanding elements of the Paris rulebook regarding NDC reporting and carbon markets, among others. The development of a truly global carbon market will go a long way towards improving the marketability of green policies and reducing the total cost of implementing national climate commitments by more than half. Dear friends, one of my takeaways from COP26 is that for the first time in a very long time, we have a destination with near unanimous support, a carbon neutral, sustainable world, where we can continue to be, where we will continue to be challenged is the pace and specific direction by which we will get there. Let us not forget there was a time not too long ago when even the mention of such a destination was cause of outcry. But we must continue to put pressure where it is needed. To achieve meaningful progress in climate action, it is vital to reach the $100 billion threshold in annual support to developing countries to rebuild trust among nations. I'm disappointed, as many of you are, that this threshold will not be met until 2023 at the earliest. To compensate for this shortcoming, we must accelerate efforts to ensure all countries have access to the latest technological innovations and strategic partnerships that will help bridge the energy divide sustainably. Furthermore, our efforts to bridge the financing gap must simultaneously support efforts to recover from COVID-19 pandemic. We live in a world of multiple interlocking challenges. We do not have the luxury of dealing with them one at a time. No single country can face either alone. We must do it together and extend support where it is needed. This means addressing issues such as debt forgiveness, eliminating illicit financial flows, lowering remittance costs, and increasing access to existing funding to maximize avenues for resource mobilization. Without global solidarity and sustainable solutions to tackle the twin challenges of climate change and COVID-19, all countries risk losing hard-won development gains, as well as opportunity to develop the physical space needed to safeguard our planet's climate health. It is understood that private sector has made more than $100 trillion worth of commitments to achieve net zero targets. While this is welcome, we must push for clarity on how those resources will be utilized. Will their support work towards carbon neutrality by 2050? Will they align with local and national climate targets? Greenwashing must not be allowed. There is too much at stake. Excellencies, we know that achieving 1.5 will require significant upscaling of both mitigation and adaptation financing, including through nature-based solutions championed throughout the UN decade of ecosystem restoration. It will also require greater coordination of financing solutions for climate action, biodiversity protection, land restoration, tackling pollution, and achieving circular economies. In this regard, as part of my vision of my presidency of hope, I will convene a Moment for Nature event in July 2022. This event will allow member states and relevant stakeholders to reflect on the outcomes of various summit-level events on the environment held during the 76th session. It will help assess where environmental action overall is lacking, what synergies can be unlocked to accelerate action, including on environmental financing, which areas the international community must prioritize next. Excellencies, I wish you the best of luck in today's discussion. Trust that you can count on my support in your efforts to rapidly upscale climate financing. And I thank you for this kind invitation once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for that superb speech. You have raised a number of issues, dilemmas, which we are now going to spend the next hour sorting out and working our way through. So the challenge is on. And we are extremely grateful that you've taken time off your very busy schedule today to come and address us and raise these very pointed, sort of points, if I can, pointed points, doesn't really work, pointed remarks, for which we are very grateful. Thank you. And we look forward to our continued engagement with you and your office. Thank you so much. If I could now invite the panelists to take their seats, and we will begin our round of discussion. And I would like to also welcome Rachel Kite from Medford, from Tufts University, of course, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, who's joining us online. And I understand you were a graduate of Tufts, so very good. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our round of discussion. First, I would like to introduce the panel who will conduct the discussion, and I'm privileged to coordinate it. And then I will invite each speaker to speak for a few minutes, and then we will engage in the discussion fully. So I'd like very first to introduce you, and it's an individual who needs almost no introduction. He's so well known in the UN, His Excellency Ambassador Osama Mahmoud, Abdul Khaliq Mahmoud, the permanent representative of Egypt to the UN, who is a very familiar friend to all of us, and welcome Your Excellency to this panel. I'd also like to introduce you to His Excellency Ambassador James Kariuki, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the UK to the UN, also someone who's very familiar to all of us. We've been around this place for a long time, and again, James, welcome to the UN. Ambassador Selwyn Hart, Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Climate Action, is an expert who needs no introduction to anyone involved in climate change and the climate change agenda, and it's an honor to have you with us, Selwyn. Ms. Rachel Kite, as I mentioned, Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, who is also recognized as a leading expert when it comes to climate and finance. Welcome, Rachel, and I'm delighted you were joining us today. And last but not least, my colleague and friend at IPI, Ms. Jimena Lieva Roche, the Head of Peace and Sustainable Development at IPI. So as you can see, we have representatives from the current and future COP presidencies. To my right, one of the goals of this event is for all of us to better understand what needs to happen in the next 12 months within UNFCCC and outside it regarding climate finance. We also have experts from the UN and academia that can provide insights on the specific drivers and policies needed if implemented, can accelerate the transition to a net zero economy. To start off the discussion, we turn to the next COP host, COP27. It is my pleasure to welcome again the permanent representative of Egypt, His Excellency Ambassador Mahmoud. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Your Highness Prince Zeid Al Hussein. Allow me at the outset to express my deepest appreciation to you personally, Honorable President of the IPI, and our dearest colleagues of Qatar, Ambassador Ali Al Thani and her team, for organizing and taking the initiative to organize today's event. My appreciation is also extended to my colleagues, the speakers at today's event, for their informative presentations to follow. Egypt is honored to host COP27 in November 2022, and we will ensure that it will be a COP where the positions of the African continent and the developing countries are further reflected and advanced in the context of UNFCCC. Allow me in this context to highlight the following two main points. Firstly, the needs and challenges of developing world and countries regarding climate finance. The UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement has achieved a very delicate balance between adaptation and resilience on one side and mitigation on the other side. In this regard, I would like to stress that the implementation of the commitments announced by developing countries is directly related to the amount of support provided by the developed countries, especially through the $100 billion per year in the context of the UNFCCC. In this connection, the $100 billion and the establishment of the Greek Climate Fund contributed to strengthening the trust in the negotiations process that resulted in the Paris Agreement. Yet recent reports pointed to the failure to reaching the $100 billion target. This led to a new fear, namely the decline of trust, more or less, in the negotiations process. Moreover, the latest needs report by the Standing Committee on Finance of the UNFCCC pointed to the fact that the needs of developing countries to implement NDCs up to 2030 is on the scale of $5.6 trillion. To achieve our collective commitments, financial instruments is a key element in the decision-making process of developing countries in connection to access to climate finance. While several developing countries face challenges such as internal and external debts, concessional finance will be of crucial importance in the coming years. This will allow the decision makers in developing countries to make the necessary decisions regarding climate change while not burdening the future generations with additional debts. Also, I would like to stress on the importance of transparency of the support provided from developed countries to developing countries. This will lead to facilitating access to climate finance, as well as strengthen the trust between all the parties, and stress on the commitment and pledges of the developed countries in the context of UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement. In order to keep below the 2 degrees centigrade in accordance with the Paris Agreement, we need to address this issue in a comprehensive and holistic approach, which includes the scientific recommendations of the IPCC report and the NDCs, the needs assessment in developing countries, and follow-up mechanism on progress in this regard. Finally, on this point, I wish to highlight the importance of formulating a new climate financing goal by 2025 from the current basis of the $100 billion. Secondly, from Glasgow to Sharm El Sheikh, the Glasgow outcomes included a number of directives that included requesting the Standing Committee on Finance to prepare reports on the definitions regarding climate finance, the progress in achieving the $100 billion target, a report on the new collective goal on finance. The outcomes included a request to all parties to the UNFCCC to present their revised NDCs before the end of 2022. I would like to emphasize that these NDCs are somehow conditional. We're raising the ambition of the developing countries must be met with the provision of financing and technology from the developed countries. Egypt is of the view of the importance of making financial flows in line with emission reductions and enhancing resilience. They go with each other hand in hand. In this connection, we see the urgent need to exchange best practices and share experiences while with developing countries to mobilize resources in the areas of green bonds and debt for nature swaps. This will ensure the provision of financial resources without creating additional burdens, as I keep repeating, on both developed and developing countries. Therefore, Egypt believes in the importance of formulating an international genuine dialogue regarding climate finance to identify the actual needs of developing countries in order to achieve the national commitments. In light of the above, Egypt emphasizes the necessity of accelerating the transition to implementation after the drafting of the new mechanism for implementing the Paris Agreement was completed in Glasgow. Therefore, we will put forward a number of substantive initiatives to address the issues of financing and adaptation during the presidency of COP27. These initiatives will aim at achieving the balance in financing between mitigation and adaptation, as well as creating a mechanism of experience transfer and exchange of information regarding access to finance and resources mobilization for a variety of resources, including innovative financing. Finally, I would like to reconfirm our commitment to the successful preparations of COP27 and our keenness to consult with all stakeholders, all the parties, especially, of course, the UK, given the great successes they have achieved in Glasgow and the very positive outcomes we have had in Glasgow in context of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. I do thank you very much, Prince.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for that insightful introduction to your priorities at COP27. You were so enthusiastic to lead that you actually began to take from his remarks because Ambassador Karaoke is going to focus on the outcome of COP26, which is a good sign. Ambassador, please, will you give us a reflection of how you saw the issue of financing at COP26 and the outcomes as we prepare for COP27?
Thank you. Well, I don't think we're too far apart in our assessment. Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, friends and colleagues, let me first start by thanking IPI for hosting us and convening us today. I also want to extend my thanks to everyone who supported the UK deliver a positive outcome in Glasgow. And I say positive, we'll come back to that. I'll turn to climate finance specifically shortly, but first let me touch on some of the wider achievements of last month. Countries and institutions, civil society and businesses went to Glasgow determined to find solutions, and through an inclusive multilateral process, we think they delivered, both inside and outside the negotiations. In consensus-based multilateralism, no single party gets everything they want, and Glasgow was no different. Each of us can name issues on which we felt we went too far or not enough. But the result from Glasgow represents genuine progress. On mitigation, 1.5 remains within reach, but only with immediate and further global action. 90% of global GDP is now covered by net zero commitments. Countries home to over 90% of global forests committed to halt deforestation by 2030. And the Glasgow Climate Pact brings parties back to the table next year to increase ambition, signals the end of coal, and finalizes the Paris rulebook. On adaptation, the pact doubles adaptation finance and provides a long overdue focus on loss and damage. Now, turning specifically to finance, the UK made this a priority of our COP campaign, including energetic campaigning from the Prime Minister and close partnership with the Secretary General, and I look forward to hearing from Selwyn on his perspective. We achieved significant progress. The US will double its annual public climate finance by 2024 to $11.4 billion. Germany will increase climate financing from 4.5 to 6.8 billion per year by 2025. Japan will contribute an additional $10 billion over the next 5 years. These are just some of the announcements that were released in the run-up to COP and reflected the sense of building momentum. We didn't quite get there, but we got close. And from the private sector, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which aligns private capital with science-based net zero commitments, now represents over 450 firms across 45 countries, which control $130 trillion of private capital. There were also further commitments to improve access to and quality of finance. Now, collectively, we fell short of the $100 billion goal by 2020, but there was agreement to continue discussions on long-term finance through 2027 and to begin an open and inclusive process for setting a new collective quantified post-2025 goal. We also saw multilateral development banks shifting. In a joint statement at COP26, MDBs called for a significant expansion and acceleration of climate action across countries and economic sectors. Notably, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development announced it will increase the proportion of its green investments to more than 50% of annual investment by 2025 and align all operations with the Paris Agreement by 2023. This is a positive signal for the future and a signal of direction of travel. Lorenza Gonzalez of the World Resources Institute probably said it best when she said COP26 put in place the scaffolding for the post-2020 finance landscape. We made progress, but there is still much more to do. So over the course of our presidency, we will work with countries, urging them to take more action, honor their promises, and deliver on the expectations of the Glasgow Pact. And we will, of course, be supporting our Egyptian friends as they prepare for COP27. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for that important statement. We've now heard from both Egypt and the UK, and they have stressed the importance of meeting the $100 billion goal and the need to scale up efforts on climate finance. We also heard that increasing climate finance commitments could have and will have a domino effect on mitigation and adaptation. We will now turn to the UN and listen to the insights from Selwyn Hart, Assistant Secretary General for the Climate Action Team. Selwyn, you've said in the past that it's not only the quantity of climate finance that needs to be scaled up, but also the quality of finance that needs to change. What could be some of the most transformative measures that could trigger these shifts in quantity and quality of climate finance? Please, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. It's definitely a pleasure to join you, and thank you so much for this excellent invitation and as well as the mission of Qatar for joining you and putting this on at really this critical moment. We cannot, I really just want to stress the urgency of now, using those famous words from Martin Luther King that he delivered, I think, back in 1963. And he also said in that speech that there's this thing of being too late, right? So while the scaffolding is there, as my friend James said, we cannot lose the sense of urgency that is required for us to safely say that the world is on track. Because I'm being brutally honest, we are nowhere where we need to be in terms of keeping 1.5 alive or ensuring that there is climate resilience. That being said, Glasgow made significant progress on all fronts, including on mitigation, finance, and on adaptation. And when we look at the context in which the outcomes at Glasgow were delivered, the context is, as I think we can all agree, there's a massive deficit of trust, there's a massive deficit of credibility. On the vaccines issue, where we continue to see this massive an equitable distribution of vaccines. 8 out of every $10 in recovery spending has been spent in the developed world. The debt situation in the developing world is at crisis levels. Countries have been cut off from low-cost financing. Their debt levels are unsustainable. There's limited fiscal space. So that is the context that countries from the majority of the developing world entered the discussions in Glasgow on. Quite frankly, many of them were very angry at the response to their concerns. And the Secretary General, in all of his interventions, repeatedly said, please place yourselves in the shoes of a leader or a minister from the developing world approaching Glasgow. And I think were it not for the skill of the UK presidency to deliver a consensus outcome, we would not have seen the type of progress that we saw in Glasgow. So kudos to Alok Sharma, his team, Archie Young, Alison Campbell. They really helped to bring countries together in a very difficult political and economic context. So Glasgow has given us a lot of homework. And on the issue of finance, the scale and quantity of climate finance, we all agree needs to increase significantly. It's beyond regrettable that more than 10 years after making the $100 billion commitment, it's still not being delivered, and it will not be delivered until 2023. Right? At a time when the developed world has mobilized, and Mr. President, you said it, over $17 trillion in recovery spending. We're still not able to bridge a $20 billion gap on the 100 billion. But the 100 billion is a small percentage of what needs to be done to effect the energy transition. And we're hearing from private finance that private finance is ready to be deployed at scale. Some estimates point to $3 to $4 trillion a year in clean energy investments primarily from the private sector. So how do we re-engineer the system? And I would love to hear Rachel's take on this to provide a bridge between public finance and private finance. The private finance is needed at scale to accelerate and effect this transition. And the role of the MDBs will be absolutely critical in serving as a bridge between public and private finance. The second major set of homework on the finance agenda is on the balance between adaptation and mitigation finance. 30 years after these climate negotiations, we've done at best 25% in terms of balancing adaptation and mitigation finance, 25% of adaptation finance. It's about $20 billion a year in 2019. When we have estimates that the cost of adaptation in the developing world by 2030 will be as much as $300 billion a year. And that does not take into account loss and damage, which was a priority at COP26 and which will be even more of a priority at COP27. For us to increase the share of adaptation finance, it first needs political commitment, and we welcome the doubling of adaptation finance, this commitment in the Glasgow Climate Pact. But it will also require an amazing amount of creativity, again, from the MDBs, from the bilateral agencies, and from countries themselves, vulnerable countries, really to ensure that the supply of finance is able to find a destination. The third major priority on the finance agenda is the issue of access. And this was, for the very first time, highlighted in very detailed and specific ways in the Glasgow Climate Pact. We need to address the issue of eligibility. GDP per capita should not be the only criteria for accessing grant and concessional resources to fight the climate crisis. This is particularly of concern for the small island developing states who are disproportionately impacted by climate change, as well as countries in the Central American region, of course, and other middle-income developing countries, but who don't have access because of their per capita income. The issue of bureaucracy and red tape in the MDBs and the climate funds, that must also be addressed with some degree, with a high degree of urgency. Why can't a single window be created for vulnerable and small developing countries? Why must they have to meet all these different access criteria attached to finding finance to address the climate crisis? And the fourth and final point is on the quality. Too many loans at a time when countries are facing escalating levels of debt. Countries can no longer take on debt, especially debt, to address the climate crisis. So there really needs to be a more focus on grants and concessional low-cost financing as well. And this is also related to the mobilization of private finance, because if we can bring private finance in, that will not affect the debt situation of countries, this could also help as well. So finally, as we go into COP27 and beyond, we really need to address these four important issues on the climate finance agenda: the scale and quantum of finance, the issue of balance, issues of access, and also issues of quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Selwyn. Forthright as always, and always welcomed. Rachel, Selwyn almost took my job by saying that you have to offer us some insight on, and you're an expert on this issue of how we better align the greater financial system to the Paris Agreement goals. You have the floor, Rachel, and we're delighted to see you with us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, and it's a great privilege to be on the panel with all the right people. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to make 5 very quick points. The first is that the inability to mobilise public funds at scale plays into a narrative which is very dangerous for the world, for all of us, because it can be exploited by those who have no interest in outcomes which are positive. By that I mean that the failure to deliver the public funds as promised is being picked up as a climate colonial narrative, which we have seen spike really, even since Glasgow, which was only just a few weeks away, although it feels much longer. And I think that it is therefore incumbent upon Alok Sharma and his team and the UK government to, as they hand the baton over to our Egyptian friends, to try to find a way to bring that 2023 100 billion forward to 2022. I think it would make everything a lot easier if we just sort of check that off. The second point is that the $130 trillion of finance under management that was part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, despite being very fuzzy at the edges, and despite the fact that over the course of the next few months, the leadership team there will have to put rules in place so that we know to what extent that $130 trillion really is net zero, and that is a process. But it had a powerful effect beyond just galvanizing the financial community. And its powerful impact was to focus on the need for transparency, accountability, credibility, and integrity in pledges. And I think it was extraordinarily welcome that the Secretary General stepped into the fray and called for an expert group to put guardrails around the kinds of non-state actor pledges we're seeing, because we need that to be real, just as we need government pledges to be real. But it also had an extremely powerful impact in, this is my third point, because it really put the focus on the transfer mechanisms that are not working for public and private finance to flow to developing countries in particular. And those transfer mechanisms for the last 70 years have been the Bretton Woods institutions and the other parts of the multilateral development bank and international financial development financial system that have been built out. They're not fit for purpose in that they are not sufficiently aligned with Paris. And this was highlighted clearly at COP26. They are not sufficiently ambitious or risk-taking, given the nature of the ramp up that we need to see in green investment over the next 10 to 20 years. They are too slow moving. They are too cumbersome and bureaucratic. And we have no alignment between the EU, the US, and China in how those three, each one of whom has a big pact of how it is going to invest in the developing world. Those are not aligned in terms of priorities, in terms of what counts, what doesn't count, what will be invested in under what terms. And we run the risk that we just sort of burden developing countries with even more need to sort of pass between different systems of help. So what can we do about this? Well, we can align, depending on what the risk appetite of the owners of the Bretton Woods institutions is, we can align incentives for management of these institutions to take more risk, to move faster, to blend finance more effectively, to put more resources deployed close to where the clients are, helping them build the kinds of regulatory systems they need. We can ask for, through the G7, the G20, urgent work to happen on specific measures that can be taken to reduce the cost of capital in developing countries. We can, if we want to have even more appetite, we can re-examine the articles of the private sector lending arms of the Bretton Woods institutions to insist that they originate deals and that we actually start distributing their portfolios into the hands of sovereign funds that seek green investment, so that the capacity of the private sector lending arms of the development banks are able to source even more deals. So we just need to move more quickly. And of course, if we have a lot of appetite, we could actually revise the articles of all of the Bretton Woods institutions to ensure that they take more risk appetite and do things which we need them to do at this moment of reconstruction and development. Two very quick final points. The voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets can now start to move forward, having the Paris in Glasgow. Needs rules road as well, and in the next 6 months we will see the first iterations of guidelines and guardrails for activities in the voluntary carbon market, and that's going to be very important because some of the trading that we're going to see now will run the risk that it will not be of integrity, in which case we will see some disruption in the market, and there is an extraordinary amount of pent-up capital that wants to get into voluntary carbon markets, but it has to work for the benefit of recipient countries, and it has to work for the benefit of 1.5 degrees. And then finally, we ran to the limits of diplomacy on loss and damage finance until the United States and the European Union get comfortable with what is really at stake in loss and damage financing. And the King Canute approach to loss and damage diplomacy, which is we just don't like it, we just don't want it, won't happen because we're now living in the era of loss and damage. And so I hope to see track 1.5 or track 2, a small group diplomacy, perhaps led by the UK with Egypt, to try to find a way to get to a constructive dialogue on loss and damage financing. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for that excellent presentation. And finally, now we will move to my colleague and friend, Jimena. You have the floor.
Thank you, Zeid, and thank you, colleagues. It's great to be the last because everything has been said by now. So I can be very brief. And maybe let me start with the point that everyone touched upon towards the end, but it's actually becoming a forefront issue, which is the issue of loss and damage. We had the great privilege to work closely with the Maldives in Glasgow on these topics on loss and damage. And in the negotiation rooms, we were surprised to see loss and damage being treated with the same old tactics. The urgency in the streets, the anger that the youth were kind of screaming with the posters outside the negotiation rooms was really not reflective inside. Inside, it was all tactics. Anything, any word related to finance was completely blocked from the text in loss and damage. And there's been quite an evolving need to put loss and damage at the forefront as we're seeing some of these effects being irreversible. So we need to ask all developed countries to really reflect on their positions on loss and damage, because this topic is not going to leave. It's only going to increase. And the tactics in that room were tactics that maybe could have been acceptable in 2010, but not in 2021. It was unacceptable. And the ministers in the final plenary said, you're sentencing us to death by these words. You're sentencing us to a lack of existence in 20 to 30 years. So the varying urgencies displayed in Glasgow don't really connect with the colonial narrative that Rachel was alluding to, and others in this panel. So I would take on what Rachel said. If the NDCs are going to be placed in 22 with greater ambition, the $100 billion goal also needs to be met by 2022. That's how it's always been. Mitigation, adaptation, finance, and I would add now loss and damage. Not at the end, not at the tail end. It needs to be forefront in our language and in our requests as in the developing world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jimen. And I since I was there with you, support and echo everything that you said. I'd have two questions to the panelists. One concerns, it came from a discussion I had with someone from the sort of world of capital markets, who pointed out that there was only one fund, to his knowledge, that was devoted entirely to the issue of adaptation. That if there is to be a mobilization, and there is at the moment a gathering feeling that there will be a mobilization of financing from private sources, this would be dedicated almost entirely to mitigation, and only one fund is dedicating itself only to adaptation. How can we change that? And the second point is that we speak of a 50-50 adaptation mitigation goal, when, as I just said, if most of what is to be gathered from the private sector, or let's say private capital, will be devoted to mitigation, why can't the ambition for adaptation be higher? Why can't it be a 90% adaptation and 10% mitigation from public finance, from sort of public financing sources? Is that too unreasonable, or are we going back to this point that Selwyn raised, and you spoke to as well, Rachel, this matter of trust, still being a fundamental issue? And I have to also agree that the UK presidency was really brilliant in trying to hold all of it together, because the absence of trust was manifest. Who would like to have a stab at this? Selwyn, I'm volunteering you.
Thanks. Not a problem. And on this issue of adaptation finance, the reality is that in terms of adaptation finance, it will be primarily public money for now. Right? Adaptation finance, especially in the vulnerable countries, is a public sector expenditure. It's invested in climate resilient infrastructure. It's putting early warning systems in place. It's providing support for insurance in agriculture, fisheries, etc. So it is a public, primarily a public finance expenditure, primarily in small and poor countries. In terms of the percentages, the reality is, as I said earlier, is that 30 years into the climate negotiating process, we've had this significant and embarrassing imbalance between what is provided for adaptation and finance and what is provided for mitigation finance. 2019 was probably the best year, and that's only 25%. 25% of total climate finance went to adaptation. And that's a mere 20 billion thrown against $300 billion problem in 2030. So we have a problem. And this is why the Secretary General, as a first step, not as a final step, was very vocal in calling for at least 50% of climate finance to be provided to support adaptation and resilience building in the developing world. The impact was that it brought attention. Mind you, Yemena and I sat next to each other in the group of 77 in China for many years, advocating for this 50%, and we were not heard. We were not heard. We were not heard. Having the voice of the Secretary General, honest broker, providing this support to this call from the most vulnerable developing countries shifted the needle. It shifted the needle significantly. So I see this commitment in the Glasgow Pact to double adaptation finance, and we're looking at doubling the 25% to 50%, at least 50% by 2025, as an important first step. But it will require action within the multilateral development banks to support countries to develop those robust project and program pipelines, as well as our colleagues in the bilateral agencies. And countries themselves will need to integrate climate risk, climate adaptation, and climate resilience building across the entire financial system, across their planning processes. So I see this as exciting times for advancing the adaptation and resilience agenda in countries, across regions, and globally as well. And hopefully over time, we will be able to find ways of mobilizing private finance at scale to address the massive adaptation and resilience challenges. But as Rachel said, it will require innovation. It will require innovation. The system is currently not in any way built to deliver on this agenda, and it will require innovation.
So Rachel, having just heard this from Selwyn, is there, in the form of a Venn diagram, a region where renewable energy technology and resilience overlap? In essence, where you can use the conditions in certain countries where resilience needs to be deepened as a proving ground for technologies for which you can secure private financing. In other words, it's not either one or the other, but there is somewhere in the middle, and you could have a blend of public and private financing for those sorts of projects. So is this too far-fetched, and am I reading it completely wrong?
No, it's not far-fetched at all. I think you've got a problem in that you've got countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We have countries that have got reasonable NDCs with very detailed plans on how they intend to expand access to energy. That would be through renewable technologies. And it's very difficult for them to get investments with a cost of capital that makes it reasonable. If they are to issue a sovereign green bond, the benefit to that green bond is experienced in the developed world, not for them. So we need some innovation there as well. And then the development finance comes in and is just too sliced and diced, honestly. Development agencies are still picking pet projects and pet themes, where I think we need to have pooled resources going behind plans which are Paris aligned. But I think that there are areas of the world where, for example, the Sahel can be solarized. You're building off the back of the Green Wall project. But those are the cost of capital is very high. These are countries which have governance deficits. These are countries where Europe and the North is looking to offshore refugees and migrant movement, but not necessarily investing in renewable energy at scale. We have issues of transmission and infrastructure that have to be built. But these are the kinds of things that we have to sit down and solve like this year and in the next 2 to 3 years. I think you can see more scaling of the deal that was done with South Africa. It's not done yet. That's on paper. Now the money has to flow, the $8.5 billion behind a government-owned plan for deep decarbonization. And so we could start looking at a platform to replicate that. But the final thing I want to say is that there is a scenario whereby all of this private capital that now needs to invest in green assets because it's committed to net zero. And while it's not regulated to net zero, it is getting pressure from investors, and it knows that regulation will come, especially in Europe. Those companies, those financiers are looking for access to not just to invest in green infrastructure, but they're going to need to meet their own net zero targets. They're going to need to have access to nature-based solutions and things like this in order to meet their own net zero commitments. So you can imagine, just as the Africa Group argued in Glasgow, that a percentage of any funds from any kind of carbon credits or any carbon market activity flow into the Adaptation Fund. So I think Africa argued for 5%. But you could, aside from that, you could also see that, for example, a bank may, on behalf of its clients, all of whom need to meet the net zero commitment on the basis of a science-based pathway, that they may invest in mangrove assets throughout Central America, for example, which would have a huge adaptation impact, which would have a very important impact in meeting net zero, which would be tradable, and which would be something that they would then use to retire their own carbon footprint. So you're starting to see huge players demanding that kind of innovation. And 20 odd years ago, that innovation was taken forward by multilateral development banks or development finance institutions or by NGOs. Now, I think countries themselves, in some cases, are ready to come forward with those kinds of schemes. But that's where the potential is. But it's very early days, and we will need both guardrails and transparency to make sure that it works. But there is a potential for a private flow of finance into adaptation, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it could happen in the next few years.
And could I ask you, Rachel, and all of the panelists, I mean, who leads this? It seems to be quite a disparate effort. You have the MDBs, you have the IFIs, you have, of course, sovereign governments, you have the United Nations, the First Secretary General. Does it need a central pilot to sort of coordinate this so that there is some sort of logic and sanity to the way that this all works in the sequence? Or is it just at various points in time, a particular leader of a particular institution will drive the agenda forward and then hope that there is some sort of gathering support for it? Or does there need to be a sort of centralizing, almost not a clearinghouse for ideas, but a sort of coordination mechanism? Or is that the job of UNFCCC? Who is going to lead this?
Well, I'll just start off and then let the panel edit. But just because of the technology, I think that it's by function. Somebody needs to establish until this is all regulated, right? Somebody needs to establish the guardrails and what do we mean when we by integrity, what are the rules for transparency, credibility, etc. And you're starting to see the Secretary General's initiative pull a lot of that together. So I think that's important, and I think that's a role for at least 1 foot of that function should be in the UN. Secondly, there is eventually going to have to be some kind of sort of not tribunal, but some kind of ombuds or validation capability. And I think that should be at least semi-detached to the UN. But I think that this is now so free-flowing throughout the capital markets and throughout civil society that it's difficult to sort of put one thing over it now. We've got at least 4 stock exchanges in the world setting up voluntary exchanges already, and trading is beginning to happen. You're starting to see, you know, people talking about national platforms to replicate South Africa with no mention of any MDB being anywhere near it. So I think we are in this hybrid governance world, and we've got a glide path to a landing pad. That landing pad is effective regulation in different jurisdictions around the world. Until we get there, I think it's going to be messy, but it's hybrid, and the UN has to be concerned to make sure that we can validate things and that we can know that where we are on the journey.
Yeah, James, you would agree? I see you shaking your head in agreement, so, or nodding in agreement.
Not. I think I was going to pull back and make a couple of observations on what I've heard so far and reflections. Really, I'm not as close to the detail as those who've been working on this for many years consecutively. But what I think I observe is that somewhere between Paris and Glasgow, we went from a sense that climate negotiations were a cycle that came around every sort of peaked every 5 years and then sort of went back into the world of the experts to a linear thing. It's now a sprint. It's now a race, and you don't get to jump onto the sort of the cycle for a year and then move off. So I think that when I hear from my colleagues in the UK about how they're feeling in December, they're not feeling great, this is over, and we'll move on to something else. They're feeling, what can we do now to build, to follow up, to accelerate progress we made? How can we work with Egypt? How can we work on the issue? So I think you should expect to see the UK fully engaged and focused on these issues of finance, as you would hope from a country that's got private sector finance and a role on the boards of the MDBs. The second reflection was that the intergovernmental process is at the centre, but this is far from being an intergovernmental dynamic now. And I think that civil society has been there for a long time. But the thing that really strikes me coming back to this after a while is business, both finance, but also the energy sector, the transport sector, all of the sectors who are not just going to contribute to the solution, they're going to transform their way of doing business. And I think that makes it a radically different proposition as we go forward. And again, I think that's somewhere where I hope the UK will bring to bear expertise. But the third thing I wanted to come back to was the point that I think both Selwyn and Rachel talked about trust and the sort of the corrosive effect of not hitting 100 billion, that sense that trust is an issue between the people who provide the finance and the people who are the most vulnerable, who are the victims. I mean, I would say that, of course, that's true. And I think that trust now extends into how we treat loss and damage, how we deal with the adaptation ambition. So trust will be defined by the extent to which we are able to make progress on those areas that we've promised a lot more at Glasgow. But it's no longer a north-south issue for me. There are heroes and villains in the north and in the south, in the east and in the west, and we know who they are and they know who they are. But I think that we do, for us, our big alliances were with vulnerable countries, with SIDS and LDCs over the last year. And I think that we will have to work with the partners where we find them, whether they're around the tables of the funds and programs or the MDBs and IFIs, to make the changes that we're talking about. So I think back to MDBs, because we were talking about it before we came onto the panel, we realized that quite a lot more needs to be done. And in terms of supporting adaptation, as Selwyn says, it's going to be primarily public money. But I think that if I take away one thing from this conversation, it's we and our colleagues on the governing bodies, those MDBs, need to do quite a lot of work and do that sort of track 1, track 1.5 work on how we make a reality of those commitments on adaptation. So I think there's a lot to do, but I'm optimistic that we can do it in different ways and not get sort of stuck in a kind of north-south dynamic, but actually countries like ours, countries like the US who are back at the table, other countries who are really invested in progress here can make a difference.
No, to speak to your point, James, I had in Glasgow dinner with an old friend who has been advising some of the energy companies, leading energy companies. And this is entirely anecdotal, but she believed that up until about 8 or 9 months ago, that there was a lot of greenwashing, but that the penny has dropped. And it speaks to what your sense of the sort of terrain is now when it comes to the positioning of the energy companies. And it may be premature to say this, but the impression she has is that there is something that's changing, which is good. Selwyn, Rachel spoke of the need for the Secretary General, the UN, to still play a role, not maybe, as James was saying, the central or the governing role, but a critical role. It was quite astonishing for me to have been at COP26 and largely see the UN absent. Most of the specialized agencies, I think, had either no one or very few the representation wasn't as strong, or there was some representation at the beginning and then they left, but many of the seats were empty. Is it a problem that the UN itself is not sort of taking this issue on as a whole of system approach, that it's leaving it to the experts like yourself, your team, UNFCCC, and the rest of the system has not bought into it? I can similarly say that there were a few ambassadors from New York who were there in Glasgow. In days gone by, one would have hoped that many more would have been present. There were ambassadors, of course, from the UK, who were, of course, accredited to the Court of St. James, who came up, but very few from New York. Is this a problem, or am I overdoing it?
I respectfully say you're probably overdoing it a bit. The COP was held in the context of a global pandemic, so not everyone traveled, but there was active participation from the UN system, and internally, as part of the various coordinating mechanisms that the Secretary General has established, and the Secretary, climate is top of the priority and priority list, and it is at the top of his list of priorities. He attended the COP on 2 occasions, the beginning and the end, and engaged very actively. And climate is also a central pillar of his common agenda as well. And I was going to make a point linking your initial question to his call in the common agenda for an inclusive multilateralism. And this is at the essence of the leadership question that you mentioned. This initiative by the Secretary General to establish or to create a group of experts to present him with recommendations on proposals on how to strengthen the credibility issue of the non-state actor commitments, because there's currently no central framework for measuring, reporting, and verifying these commitments from non-state actors. And while there are some really good actors, their efforts should not be undermined by those who are seeking to engage in greenwashing. And this proposal came not only from civil society, but it was strongly supported by private sector and financial institutions, as well as states and local governments who are doing the right thing. Right, so the Secretary General stepped into this breach and will create and set up this expert group, really to provide recommendations on how to bring some order, how to bring some degree of clarity, and that's the type of leadership I see coming from the United Nations. In addition, when one looks at the throughout Glasgow, the Secretary General was clear that the South African model of building coalitions around key emerging economies to accelerate their transition away from coal, that's a model that should be deployed. And he is working, albeit behind the scenes, with key governments, financial institutions, and private sector entities, really to replicate this model in other key emerging economies. In Glasgow, the finance minister of Indonesia made it crystal clear that Indonesia is prepared to phase out coal in 2040 if it receives the support of both public and private finance. We've heard similarly from Vietnam as well. And we know that that the single most important step to keep 1.5 degrees alive is the phasing out of coal as soon as possible. So that leadership needs to come in different forms and in different places. We need the G20 and the G7 to be mobilized around this agenda and be more united, as Rachel said earlier. They're also the majority shareholders who sit on the boards of the multilateral development banks, and they will need to exercise that leadership to address the concerns on the alignment and the pace of action that is needed. But finally, on the UN system, as the Secretary General has said, the system is mobilized. The system is fully mobilized and united around supporting keeping 1.5 alive, as well as on the finance and adaptation pillars of the Glasgow Climate Pact and the Paris Agreement. We also have a resident coordinator system, and we speak on a regular basis with the resident coordinators who will be meeting in New York in the next few days, and they are our voices and our feet on the ground. And we're working very closely with the RCs to ensure that they can support countries, especially the small and the vulnerable countries who in many instances lack the capacity. They're not the high profile countries, but who need the support of the UN and the UN system really to build climate resilience and also to accelerate their transition towards net zero.
Yes, absolutely, James.
Just wanted to come in briefly to just really support what Selwyn said. We were very grateful as the UK for the restraint showed by the UN system and also delegations in New York, missions in New York who didn't all come to Glasgow in extraordinary numbers. There were still very, very many people there. But I think that people, we did a lot of briefing for delegates in New York on managing health risk, on essentially what they would need to do to come in and stay and operate in Glasgow, and it worked because the infection rates inside COP were actually lower than they were outside in Scotland, thanks to all of the efforts that went into making this safe. So I think we appreciate that people didn't all come who might have come otherwise. But having said that, I mean, Selwyn's point is absolutely right. It's not about everyone coming to one place at one point in time. It's about what happens in the boards of the agencies in New York, but also Rome and Vienna and Nairobi. It's about what happens in Washington, as we've talked about, and it's about what happens in the field. And I was in Niger with the Security Council at the end of March, and at the end of October, sorry, and we saw a lot on security, but we also talked to the UN country team, and the UN country team is working very closely with the government of Niger on adaptation and resilience and how they cope with desertification and climate as a security issue. So I think it's absolutely right that the work is done at country level as well as in the headquarters.
So against this rash of optimism, can I pick up on this in the sense that there is a sort of identifiable delta in the positive sense? There's a vector now that seems to be moving in the right direction. Is it resilient enough to withstand whatever potential shock may come at COP28, which will coincide with actually it's COP29, isn't the US elections in 2024. We saw what happened between 2016 and 2020. Is what we're seeing now strong enough to withstand shocks within the political conditions of certain leading states. I mean, has the ship, so to speak, left the port, and we're on a track? We're going to have setbacks and regressions because we speak about the boards of MDBs or the executive board at the World Bank, right? And they are prone to political sort of pushback. So how resilient is this positive delta that we're seeing? Is it sort of going to see itself play out no matter what happens, because the demand that is being placed on us by the climate and the scientists and those who know what's happening in the small island states, developing states, makes it almost inevitable that we will have to grapple with this no matter who's in power in which country. James, you're going to have to take this.
I'd be the last person on the panel to comment on US politics, but I mean, I was in Washington in 2012 to 2016, so I know how much the administration then, how much effort they put into sort of baking in climate policy into legislation, into executive actions to sort of provide that resilience. Obviously, we went back and the US made a political decision to withdraw. Is the system now resilient? I think in most parts of the world, there is bipartisan agreement, understanding that this is a one-way direction. We can't roll back. Certainly in the UK, and I'd say across Europe, domestic politics doesn't, it might change at the margins, but it's fundamentally, there is a bipartisan consensus on where we go. I think the US is interesting. I mean, maybe the resilience that you build into the US system comes from the extent to which the private sector is committed. So if energy companies, the financial services sector, the transport sector is all now preparing itself, building itself for a low carbon transition, that provides a bit of resilience to what happens in the political sphere. But I'm not going to predict what will happen next in US politics. I'll let others
Rachel,
do that.
Do you have any insight on what you see happening in the United States? And is you know?
Well, I think James is right. Under the Obama administration, there was this sort of trying to bolt everything down so that it couldn't be upended. And I think if you're in Washington now, that is going on furiously across every department of government because of the fears of what might happen in 2022 in the midterms, let alone in 2024. So I think it's a perilous political dynamic, but underneath that, there's not an American car manufacturer that's going to be manufacturing internal combustion engines after a date this decade, and the financial markets, and the bar was lowered within GFANZ to get all of the big American banks in, but they're in, and they're not happy, and they're sort of rummaging around, and they're moaning and complaining because it's all messy and we don't have certainty. And there's lots of fistfights going on over how quickly the SEC will do one thing or another. And Janet Yellen is trying to sort of bring the whole thing together in a coordinated approach across the US government. But the direction of travel is there. And if you're a major captain of finance, you're going to want to see emerging alignment of regulation. You're going to want to see a certainty moving forward. You're not going to want to see flip-flopping and reversal. It's only going to affect your competitive abilities and your ability to sort of manage what is now universally agreed as a macro-prudential risk. So I think on the one hand, that's all moved much, much further along as well. But I think it's a perilous time. I think another country, as diplomats described the Biden administration's approach to climate diplomacy as, we know America's back, but just with a big flashing D above them now. So there is a sort of an antagonism with China. There is a America first that's still in there. And I think that is occupying a lot of time and attention in Washington. I think Taiwan, some of the other big critical issues which are on the plate at the moment could make the job of our Egyptian hosts next year more complicated. And all finance, most of the finance the public finance has to go through Congress, and that's log jammed at the moment. So I think it's a very nerve-wracking time.
Thanks. I don't have a crystal ball, and like James, obviously I can't comment on the U.S. domestic politics, but looking at where we are now, as opposed to I would say four or 5 years ago, a completely different place. As James said earlier, 90% of global emissions and of the global economy are committed to net zero, not as ambitious enough. We have virtually every major economy submitting an NDC, not ambitious enough. But many of them have also put in place concrete policies and measures to implement many of these commitments. So the direction of travel is absolutely clear. In terms of money and markets, as Rachel said, if you plan to still make an internal combustion engine vehicle in 2030, you're not going to be able to sell it to many of the major markets. If you're looking to invest in a coal-fired power plant, no matter where, in the 2030s, good luck with that. Or if you're also looking to ensure a coal-fired power plant in the 2030s, good luck with that as well. So while there will always be uncertainties, there will always be setbacks. I think, and it's not my island optimism. I think that the direction of travel is clear. The political, but also the economic and financial environment has shifted significantly over the course of the last 5 years. This is why these next 2 years will be absolutely critical for us to bring that credibility and integrity to the net zero commitments of companies and private financial institutions. So, and as Rachel said, develop a pathway towards regulation for these entities. These next 2 years will be absolutely critical to ensure that countries, even though their NDCs might not be as ambitious enough, they put in place concrete policies, measures, develop the regulatory frameworks, etc., to enhance ambition. These next 2 to 3 years, we need to get these coalitions up and running. We need to get them working so that countries like Indonesia, India, Vietnam, and others who have clear ambitions to deploy renewable energy, that there's finance, private and public finance available to support them. These next 2 to 3 years, we need to ensure that the vulnerable countries have access to finance to build climate resilience and adapt. So lots of uncertainties, but I think these next 2 years will be absolutely critical for us to ensure that the system is able to deliver on the promise of Paris and on the Glasgow Climate Pact.
Thank you, Selwyn. Jimena.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm as positive as others here, and I'm usually the most positive, so it's a bit of a strange moment for me. But I think that, okay, the travel course has been set, but I don't think we're pushing the accelerator enough. Like, we are slow, we are still very incongruent in our policies. We see the COVID packages and stimulus packages are still largely brown, not green. So while there's a positive travel direction, I think that, as Selwyn mentioned, this next 2 to 3 years until 2030, we significantly have to change and accelerate. So what can push the needle? Because the issues that we need to address, tax havens, debt relief, carbon pricing, they're not very popular, not very sexy, not very glamorous, but are incredibly important. So how do we tackle these important aspects in order to get us there? What is the future governance system in finance? Are we envisioning a similar body like the IPCC with science, or not? Like, does it need to be more decentralized? But how does this governance in the finance space look like? that's a question that if we have time, I would love to hear more about it. And how can we really push the needle in order to really get us there, not in 2050, but I would say in 2030? Thank you.
And I think to reflect what it is that you were saying, Jimena, it's clear that we're also seeing this frustration play out by the various legal actions and the legal pathways being pursued by a number of countries to seek redress, because the sort of rate of velocity, or let's say rate of change, is slower than it ought to be. And in fact, we're going to be hosting a discussion on this issue in 10 days' time. And so the more we see along the lines that you were saying, Selwyn, the more likely it is that the countries that are feeling that desperate are not going to be pushed into actions which are seen or deemed to be seen as openly confrontational, when at a time we need to build trust between the global north and the global south. This event would never have been possible without the support of the state of Qatar, for whom or for which we at IPI are entirely grateful. We were hoping to have Her Excellency, the Ambassador of the State of Qatar, Sheikh Alia Ahmed bin Saif Al Thani, with us. I'm not sure, is she? No, she won't be able to make it. Nevertheless, we're delighted that we have colleagues from the mission here, and we're entirely thankful to the State of Qatar for helping us put this together. I'm also deeply grateful to all of you for attending this panel, for your insights. We will pursue you over the next few months to do this again and see where we are as the intercessional agenda takes over. And we hope that you will bear with us and join us when you receive an invitation from us. And especially Selwyn, we have to keep him under tight control here. So thank you, all of you, for watching and listening to our incredibly gifted panelists, and very knowledgeable. And with that, we will wrap up this session. Thank you so much. Thank you.